Hello everyone, my name is Kinky, and in today's video we're going to be talking about Classic WoW again. Something that I've been mulling over since the announcement of Classic last November was, what class do I want to play? Before we get started with this, I'd just like to say that I will not be covering every spec of every class for every situation. If there's a specific class/spec combination that you're interested in that I don't cover in this video, let us know by heading down to the comments and telling us what classes you want us to go deeper into detail with. Now, I do want to say that I put a lot of focus on the endgame with this, as it is something that I want to do again because it was one of the parts of the game that I enjoyed the most. It should be noted that the leveling experience from 1 to 60 is a huge part of this game as well, but that did not factor into what classes I'm debating for playing Classic. The first question you should ask yourself is, what is my end game goal? There can be multiple answers to that, the two most popular ones being PvP or PvE. Some people will say they just want to make some sweet cash, while others just want to RP. So let's break that down, shall we? First off, PvP. Again, there are questions you have to ask yourselves. In this case, there's two. The first one being, what will Blizzard end up doing with balancing? Where will the patch cycle land? And what talents will we have? Will stuns have diminishing returns? We can't really answer this question on our own. All we can say is that we've heard the rumors of no changes, but we can't be for sure. So for now, we'll just have to shelve the thought and try and make our decisions based around not knowing what the talents and balance of the game is going to be like. The second and bigger question you have to ask yourself is, are you going to be playing BGs solo or with a friend? If you play them with a friend, the best duo comp in Classic was a geared warrior and a geared healer. It can take a while to become geared in Classic, but if you and a buddy are in it for the long haul, a warrior and healer is by far the best bet. A side note to that, leveling a warrior can suck in Classic, but having a healer backing you up from 1 to 60 makes the experience so much more enjoyable with a lot less downtime. So let's say your friends are more on the PvE side of the game and you want to play with them, but you also want to dabble in PvP as well. Good news, arguably the best solo class for PvP in vanilla was the Rogue. At the start of WoW, diminishing returns on stuns were not a thing. If I remember correctly, they were introduced about halfway through vanilla. But what still made the Rogues incredibly strong was if they were mace spec, the stun for the maces were not part of those diminishing return tables, thus making them incredibly strong in PvP. If close quarters combat wasn't the game for you, fret not. Frost mages were very strong in PvP as well. The only downside to the mage was how squishy they were. But if you could keep your enemy at range, then the mage would win 9 out of 10 times in a 1v1 situation. The last class I want to touch on here are hunters. Classic is when the whole huntard reputation started, but if a hunter had their head on straight and knew what their class was capable of doing, they could be quite dangerous. Hunters had a very large toolkit in Classic, and if they knew what they were doing, you're going to have a bad time. So now let's talk PvE. The PvE scene is a little bit different as there are more roles to fill within your group. I know PvP still has healers and you needed some kind of tanking and AV, but in a normal 1v1 situation, it's almost always going to be a DPS versus a DPS. There are again questions that we need to answer before we can come to a conclusion on this front as well. Balancing. Not only will balancing of specs help you decide what you want to play, but also the debuff restriction. There used to be a much lower limit on the debuff slots an enemy could have, which made some classes not viable in a raiding environment. The most important question, however, is, what do you want to do? What role do you want to fill? So let's say you wanted to tank. Unfortunately, in all likelihood, if you wanted to be tanking in raids, you will more than likely have to be playing a warrior. By the end of Classic, other classes were starting to get good at tanking, but with Sunder Armor and a very good kit for taking damage, warriors were still the go-to tank. However, if you were only interested in 5-mans, that does open the door a little bit for you. While leveling up, Druids and even Paladins could do their fair share of tanking in 5-mans. It wasn't ideal, but it was completely viable, especially once we got closer to the release of Burning Crusade. Note that I said while leveling up. It was very rare to see someone tanking on something other than a warrior, even in a 5-man at level 60. So what about healing? Is that what your jam's all about? Well, good news. Literally every class that has a healing spec is viable. So if you like healing, the best advice I can give you is to figure out what type of healing you like best and go play that class. Before we get into the classes, there is a little side note for leveling up with a healing spec I want to mention. This actually goes for tanking as well. Do not level up in the healing or tanking spec. The only time you should consider that is if you're playing in a full group of friends 100% of the time. Up to the mid-50s, a class that has a healing spec is fine in their DPS tree, as long as they can put on intellect and spirit gear. The same can be said for tanking. You can stay in your DPS tree as long as you have the gear you need to be able to tank. I remember doing it quite often on my Paladin. I was spec to ret, but I always carried a sword and board, as well as a full set of intellect gear to be able to heal or tank a dungeon when I needed to. It's also worth mentioning that if you're healing, the item that you're going to be wearing does not need to be your armor specialization. That does not exist in Classic. It was not uncommon for a Paladin or a Druid to be running around in half cloth gear just because it had intellect or spirit on it. Okay, so back to the classes we go. Priests are the first class we want to talk about, and priests were usually regarded as the strongest healer in Classic, and they were highly sought after, especially if you played the right race combination with your priest. Why? Because Fear Ward was a class/race specific ability that only priests of one race got. And on top of that, Fear Ward could only be placed on one person at a time, which is why you usually had so many whelp aggros in Onyxia's lair. If you like the Paladin class, get ready for a lot of raid buffing and little healing. Depending on where the talents land, this could be not as bad as some would think it is, but if they do go all the way back with no changes at all, Paladins be ready to be buffing all the time. Paladins were brought mostly for their buffs and for their occasional divine intervention and the occasional heal here and there. Divine intervention was extremely useful, especially in raids like AQ where the run back could be horrendous, and you could even have to fight through 3 hours of trash again. Shaman were in a similar boat to Paladins. They were there for their totems. Their utility was substantial because of this. They also had self-res, which could save a fight or save a run back, like I mentioned with Divine Intervention. Druids were another crucial healer like the priest. Not only was healing their primary job, but they also had great raid utility. Battle res was huge for two reasons. It could save a fight by rezzing a tank, rezzing a healer, or rezzing a DPS, or save a run back just like Divine Intervention. Something else that people don't quite understand when it comes to healing in a raid environment in Classic is something that I like to call the Healing Minigame. Mana was a huge part in Classic. Knowing when you should cast a heal and when you shouldn't was a huge deal. You need to constantly be asking yourself questions like, is someone else going to get that heal off on that tank? If I heal this person, am I going to double heal them and waste mana? A lot of healers were not using that many healing abilities either. But they did, however, use multiple ranks of those spells. So even if you only had 3 spells to cast during a fight, you were still casting 2, sometimes 3 ranks of that spell based on the needs for the fight. Healing, in my opinion, was one of the harder things to master in Classic because of the mana issues that were always plaguing the average raider. One of my personal favorite playstyles in Classic is the melee DPS role. Unfortunately, there are only 2 real viable melee specs by Endgame for PvE. First up, we have the Rogue. Rogues were strong candidates everywhere they went. There was only 2 negatives to playing a Rogue in a raiding environment. Because of the debuff limitation, Rogues were usually forced to play combat, and they were also forced to play without their poisons. This wasn't as big of a deal in 5-mans because of there being far fewer people for those debuff slots, but it was definitely an issue in the early days of raiding. Surprisingly, the second viable melee spec was the Fury Warrior. If you were lucky enough, some guilds actually did carry warrior DPS roles. Warriors were insanely gear dependent as well, so it was hard to get into raids to get the gear that you needed to be able to do well on the damage charts. However, if your guild got you and they stuck through it, they were rewarded with some of the best DPS in the game. Just don't spec into deep wounds if we end up having that limitations on the debuffs. I'd also like to mention that occasionally you would see a feral druid, but these were even more rare than the fury warrior. Like a hunter in PvP, the druid had to know their shit to get work done. If I can remember correctly, my raiding guild back in Classic had 1 feral druid by the time we got to Blackwing Lair, and 3 warriors that were fury, but were also kitted in tank gear for tanking adds. So on to the ranged DPS. Who here likes to play ranged? Well, good news, we have more than the amount of choices we had for melee. To start off, let's talk about hunters. Well, hunters were decent. Early on, they had good base damage, but something that Blizzard failed to think about when it came to damage scaling is that hunters also relied on their ammunition for damage increases. So, around Blackwing Lair, hunters started to get passed by other DPS classes, which wasn't ideal. They had great utility, however. Even without misdirect, they were often the ones to pull adds from the start of a boss fight to the corresponding tanks with a rank 1 arcane shot. They also had trank shot to remove enemy enrages, as well as they were amazing at kiting enemy mobs. One thing that hunters also had that was extremely important in a raid situation was their nature resist aura, something that the buff bot paladins couldn't do. So now let's talk about a very strong DPS and a very consistent DPS from the start of the game to the time Burning Crusade rolled around. That's the Mage. The Mage also had 2 viable specs for raiding, Frost and Fire. Most mages ran Frost based on the fact that it was great for raiding, PvP, and for farming. The Warlocks were in an interesting place for a while. When the debuff limit was only at 8, Warlocks tended to struggle at times in DPS, but they were also requested at raids for healthstones and summoning. Once the debuff limit was increased and Warlocks could more freely use their dots, their damage could be considered one of the best in the game. Something else that is worth mentioning for a Warlock was their high risk, high reward nature. Warlocks relied heavily on their life top skill to ensure they had enough mana for their spells. The first issue with this is that mana was a much bigger issue back in Classic than it is now. So, if a Warlock was using life tap for mana, they ran the extra risk of dying. Warlocks also did not have a threat reduction ability. Yes, threat was also an issue in Classic. So by a Warlock life tapping to cast even more spells, they also ran the risk of pulling off the tanks and dying from the boss. So that wraps up the 2 biggest categories with PvP and PvE. I do briefly want to touch on the classes for gold making. I do plan on having a full video made for this with the different ways to farm in Classic and the different classes that are best for those situations, but I'll give you a quick breakdown right now. Hunters are great for self-sustain and great for soloing bosses and instances. They're not as strong in AoE, but they make up for it with their own personal tank. The Mage is the AoE god of farming. They also have great escape tactics and can CC in combat, which a hunter cannot. They can make their own food, and they also have teleports. And of course, let's not overlook the crafting professions. Any class could be considered viable in this situation. Just don't be dumb and make a priest that's a blacksmith and a leather worker. At the end of the day, if you have time to spare, try out the different classes you want to play. It's also not a bad idea to have at least 2 classes at cap, one for making gold and one for your endgame progression. There are also a ton of videos you can find online of people playing endgame content on those classes that you want to play. Don't be afraid to go and check those out either. So what am I personally going to end up playing? Right now it's between 3 classes, between the Rogue, the Druid, and the Warrior. I love melee specs. That's why the Rogue and Warrior are on the list for me. I like the Warrior playstyle a little bit more than the Rogue, but the Rogue is a lot easier to level solo compared to the Warrior, and I'm not sure how many friends I'm going to be playing with. The reason the Druid is on this list is because I like to heal, and I can also level up as Feral and tank or heal dungeons, and it's also a decent farming class. It's not nearly as good as the Mage, but it's not half bad. Well anyways guys, that's how I'm making my decision on what class I'm going to end up playing in Classic when it's finally released. Let me know down in the comments if this helped you guys out at all. Anyways guys, take care and we'll see you in the next one.
Hey, it's Radit here. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe as well. It really helps out the channel. We put out multiple new videos each week and we appreciate all of your support. Thanks for watching everyone, and cheers.